I just want to introduce myself quickly. I told you earlier that some of you that I'm a reporter for News 12 right here in Brooklyn. And while I spend most of my time chasing news stories throughout the borough, I also spend much of my time being a Holocaust educator and studying about the Holocaust. It's something I've always wanted to do since I was a little girl. The reason for that is because my grandfather, too, is a survivor. And we've always had a very, very, very special relationship. And I'm going to tell you some stories today that have always stood out in my heart and in my mind. And I'm going to try really hard not to get emotional. First, I just want to tell you guys how close me and my grandpa are. I call him my papi. And ever since he's still alive today, ever since I was a little girl, we'd always play this game. And my papi would hold out his fist like this, and he'd say, "Dana, try to open my hand." And I would try so hard with both my hands to try to open up his palm, and I couldn't do it. That's how strong he was. Then the roles would be reversed, and I'd say, "Papi, try to open my hand." And I would squeeze with all my might, and my papi would take just one finger, go like that, and my hand would fly open. So that game we always played made me always think of my papi as being the strongest man I've ever met. But not just physically strong, he's also the strongest person on the inside as well. Question, who has a cell phone here? All of you have cell phones. Who knows their cell phone number by heart? Okay, all of you. So growing up, I didn't even get a cell phone until I was in 9th grade. That's when they were starting to become popular. And I was a little late to the party. My parents were very strict, and I didn't get one until 9th grade. And growing up, most kids, they know their cell phone numbers by heart. But for me, the first number that I ever had memorized wasn't a cell phone number. It wasn't any telephone number for that matter. It was the number 143499. And that's the number that was burned onto my grandfather's arm when he was in Auschwitz concentration camp. And we'll get to Auschwitz in a little bit. I know you guys have been reading up on the Holocaust. You know a little bit about it. I want to first tell you about my papi and where he grew up. He grew up in Poltusk, Poland, which is a tiny city in Poland just north of the capital. Anyone know the capital of Poland? Warsaw. Very good. You know your geography. So just north of the capital of Warsaw. And he grew up in a really, really poor family. This was before the war. 9 brothers and sisters in one home with their 2 parents, in a 1-bedroom home for that matter. My papi would tell me how about 4 kids would be in a bed. Now, of course, they argued, they fought, just like any siblings would do. But because they had to live in such close quarters, they obviously became really, really close. They learned how to truly love one another and how to truly live together in harmony. And that's how life was. They were poor, but they were happy. Now, my papi was about 14 years old when the Germans first invaded Poland, so around the same age as you guys. Because they were in such a small city, Poltusk, they knew that if they stayed there, the Germans would find them. So they started walking to Warsaw. They walked for days and days and days. They had some family there. It was a bigger city. They thought it would be an easier way to hide. Now, on their way, some German soldiers had found them, and they said to my papi's dad, who would be my great-grandfather, they said, "You're coming with us." And with a gun to his head, he had no choice in front of his entire family, his kids, his wife. And my grandpa remembers his dad walking away, looking back at them like this. And it was the last time they ever saw his father. They found out just a few days later that he had been shot and killed in a grave with all other men, Jewish men that they were able to find who were wearing beards. What they were doing is they were finding men who had beards on their faces because that signified that they were religious Jewish men. And they took all the men with beards, killed them, and threw them in a mass grave. That's all they ever knew. So imagine living with that. The last time you see your father who provided for all these children, that you're trying to mourn for him, but at the same time you have to keep moving, you have to keep surviving so that the rest of the family could go on. So finally they got to Warsaw, but soon after getting there, they were forced to live in a ghetto. Do you guys know what a ghetto is? So just to sum up quickly, a small area of the city, just a few blocks that were blocked off with barbed wire, with walls, with fences, so that the Jews would have to live in this small area and that they couldn't leave. Now, while it was terrible, they couldn't leave just this few block radius to get food, to even shower. They had no running water, to even go to a clothing store, anything, just to live a normal life. They couldn't do it, but at least they had each other. But they were living about 5 families in one room. Now, soon after, the Germans said that they needed one person from each family in the ghetto to go to a forced labor camp. My papi was the one chosen. He was only 14 years old. He was strong, he was muscular, he was fit, and he would be the one that would be able to work. And he said goodbye to his family with a gun to his head and went on a train. That was the last time he ever saw 5 of his 9 siblings and his mother. Now, he got to the forced labor camp, which was in Germany, and this forced labor camp was similar to the ghetto in terms of it was a small blocked off area just for Jews, but there were only about 50 Jews there, all of them working, doing different things that the Germans needed them to do. They had to work 24/7, no breaks, hardly any food, no showers. And my grandpa, he was assigned to work all day in the sewers. He had to clean out the sewers, he had to clean them out, make sure the filtration process was working, and he spent all day in the sewers, but at least he kind of felt like he was protected in the sewers. And every few weeks or so, the Germans would tell the Jews to take off all their clothing and throw them in a big tank of boiling water. Now, they didn't throw it in this tank of boiling water to keep them clean, but instead they did it so that the Germans wouldn't get infected, because they had to live in this area with them to supervise, make sure they were working. It was so that the Germans couldn't catch any of their diseases, of the Jewish people's diseases, that they had to throw their clothing in boiling water to get all the germs off. So my grandfather, being so starving, every day they'd get a small piece of bread that was made mostly of sawdust instead of flour, and a small bowl of soup that was made mostly with water and dirt. My grandfather, being so starving and having the ability to work in the sewer, after finding some raw potatoes that were moldy and some raw vegetables that were thrown into the sewer by people throwing their leftover waste, he said, you know what, let me take this opportunity to eat. So he took those raw vegetables and he found a way to tie them into the pocket of this thin uniform that he was wearing. And when the few weeks came, it was about 2 weeks or so, that he was able to throw his clothing into the water, he realized that would be the time that he could at least cook this food. So he threw the potatoes in with his clothing, and that's how he was able to eat, just a little bit. Now, he did this for as long as he could, but unfortunately, somebody found out. He doesn't know whether somebody told on him, whether the German soldiers saw him with their own eyes, but they told him to start digging his own grave. Now, of the 50 Jews in the camp, they all knew the grave was for him. So he felt this fear, yet a relief, because he just didn't know how he can still keep on living the way that he was. And he started digging his own grave after working so hard to survive. He said, this is it. Now, when the grave was almost completed, the German soldiers told him to lay down on the ground next to the grave to make sure that he was the same length, that he would fit inside, no problem. He lay down on the ground like he was told, with a gun to his head like there always was, and they said, great, you fit just fine. We just want it a little deeper, so keep digging a little bit, and soon that will be your new home. And my grandfather, trembling, digging, he gave up. And when he was almost done, somebody next to him, another Jewish worker, collapsed, probably because he didn't have the food, the few pieces of potatoes that my grandfather was able to put in his stomach. He collapsed, he was dehydrated, he was overworked, and the Germans said, well, we have no use for him anymore. They shot that man and threw him in the grave that my papi was digging. And in not so many words, they said to my papi, well, isn't today your lucky day? So for the rest of my papi's life, he has to live with the relief of knowing that grave wasn't for him, but the guilt of knowing that it was for an innocent person just like him. Now, that's one story that, out of all the ones I've heard from my grandfather, just have always touched my heart. It's something I could never in my wildest dreams imagine ever happening and ever being in that situation. The next story I want to tell you was when my grandfather went to Auschwitz, a concentration camp, a death camp, where more than 1 million men, women, and children were killed. Now, 6 million Jews approximately were killed in total during the entire years from 39 to 1945 during the Holocaust, but more than 1 million alone were killed just in Auschwitz, and my grandfather somehow lived and survived there for 2 years. In Auschwitz, he was working with the steel and with the iron and making different products for German manufacturing companies, and that's what he did. And every day, he didn't know whether he would be going to the showers or the gas chambers, but somehow every day for 2 years, he went to the showers and he survived. Now, a story I want to tell you is I told you how little they had to eat, the watery, dusty soup and the dusty bread. And my grandfather, at the end of a long day, he'd been feeling more dehydrated than ever. And he was so excited to finally have that dirty soup, because it was something, at least, that he could put in his stomach. And think about the thirstiest that you've ever been. I remember once playing basketball, and I was running back and forth on the court, and I just so desperately needed a sip of water. Well, that was that feeling for him, just finally taking the soup, drinking it, and waiting for it to go down that throat, that feeling of quenching your thirst. But instead of going down his throat, it came out a hole in the right side of his mouth, in his cheek. Who's had a tooth infection before, or even just a toothache? And anyone ever had a toothache? Yeah, very normal toothache, very normal thing to have. What do? You go to the dentist. Now, my papi had what started out as just a normal toothache. And he would have loved to go to the dentist, but there was no dentist in Auschwitz concentration camp. There was no doctor. They barely got to shower. They would get their bodies rinsed off. They didn't even have bathrooms, proper clean bathrooms. So the thought of a dentist, that didn't exist. So this toothache, which was so painful, eventually spread to an infection in his entire mouth, which infected his right cheek so badly that a hole the size of a penny developed right here on the side of his mouth. He had that hole for several years until he was liberated after the war, and to this day, he still has a scar. And those are the stories I wanted to tell you, because I felt like a toothache is something everyone could relate to, right? Something so simple, something that you take for granted is going to the dentist. Now, when I was a little girl, I was learning about the Holocaust in school, and I was very young, maybe anywhere from 7 to 10 years old. And I came home from school and I said to my parents, "Mommy, Daddy, I was thinking about it. Isn't it a good thing that the Holocaust happened?" And they looked at me with these looks on their faces, like they just were shocked and couldn't believe I would ask something like that. And I said, "Well, Papi, if the Holocaust never happened, would have never eventually moved to the United States. He wouldn't have left Poland, and then he wouldn't have met Nanny, and then Mom, they wouldn't have had you, and you wouldn't have had me." And I was so young and naive and ignorant that even at that young age, I didn't understand what death meant. I didn't understand murder. I didn't understand this gruesomeness. And my parents looked at me and they said, "Dana, we would do anything in the world to not be alive so that 6 million Jews could have survived. We would do anything in the world for the Holocaust to have never happened." And although I was so young, it was from those horrified looks on their faces, for the first time in my life, I understood the enormity of the Holocaust, the enormity of what my grandfather went through. And I promised myself at that young age that I would make sure that I would spend my life talking to people like you, to talk to people about my grandfather's story, and to make sure that the world never forgets. And all I can ask is that the Holocaust, we hope will never happen again, but who knows? All I can ask is that if you see injustice, if you see even bullying, mistreatment of any kind, to stand up and to do something. And I thank you all so much for having me here today. And I also want to tell you this was my first ever presentation, so I didn't want to tell you until afterwards, but thank you for giving me this opportunity.